we're within kind of 2 to 3 weeks for most flocks of weaning. And again, look, if you can at all, have a bit of distance maybe between where the ewes are going to be weaned into and where we're going to put the wean lambs into. So that final paddock that they come out of the day before weaning, and that's where we put them back into the ewes, that there's a wee bit of distance between both. That just helps let the thing settle down a wee bit. Hello, I'm Ciaran Lynch and welcome to OviCast, the Teagasc Sheep podcast. Each episode will bring you less insights, advice and technical updates for the sheep industry. In this episode of OviCast, my colleague Damian Costello steps in to host as I discuss some of the key messages from the June Sheep newsletter, from how to maintain grass quality at this stage of the season to preparing for weaning, assessing ewes for culling and getting the most out of shearing. It's a practical episode with some seasonal advice for sheep farmers as lambs approach weaning and grass growth peaks.
I suppose, Ciaran, in the early days of June, we've seen a fairly rapid lift in grass growth with the bit of moisture after the warm period. What are the key things, I suppose, to be looking out for on sheep farms at this time of year?
Yeah, I mean, look, the situation's changed quite a lot, I suppose, in the last 2 to 3 weeks. Look, the challenge this time of year is really between maintaining the right balance between grass supply and demand and trying to keep a wee bit of quality in that sward. It can be particularly challenging in June, and I think this year in particular is going to be very challenging. We've seen a rapid increase in grass growth rates, trying to keep lambs pushed on, so it's a bit of a tricky balance in what we're trying to do, I suppose. Like, if we think about it, at this stage of the season, lambs are kind of consuming around 1 to 1.2 kilograms of grass a day. That's making up a lot more of the diet. There's increasing competition from mules for high quality pasture, so it's getting that balance right between trying to get graze outs and trying to keep quality in that sward and that diet for them young lambs.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very easy for it to get ahead. And what kind of covers, I suppose, should we be aiming to have at this stage?
Look, in the pre-weaning period, we're trying to go into cover something in that order of 1,200 to 1,500 kilos or 7 to 9 centimetres. That's a nice leafy sward at that. Grazing down to a residual of 4.5 if it's getting a bit particularly stemmy, Damian, maybe in that last rotation, lifting that slightly to maybe 5 centimetres. Key thing in all this, though, is the short residency period. Like, we're trying to get in and get out of those paddocks fairly quick, at 4 to 5 days, really. What we're trying to do in that period is to get a maximised utilisation of grass and maintain quality. So we're not forced them to spend a long time grazing out maybe stemmier pasture or tighter swards. I suppose if we're looking at that overall supply of it, most parts of the country, even drought-prone areas this year, have got sufficient rain, so we can probably push it down to near the target of 10 grazing days ahead for most. If you are in a drought-prone area, you might want to add a couple of days on that, maybe up as far as 15, but we're trying to reduce that overall cover on the farm at that stage down so as we can try and keep that quality in the diet and keep them moving through it. I suppose the key thing there, Damien, is we have to kind of try and act on it then if we go above that target.
Yeah, and I suppose if you are finding maybe farms that aren't stocked as heavily, or that if they're finding that the covers are getting ahead of your target for going in at, what are your options there, I suppose?
Yeah, and I think it's probably what we've seen in the last week or two. Like, we've seen high growth rates, even up to as far as 100 kilos a day on some farms, per hectare on some farms. So yeah, it has been tricky. And I suppose it goes back to the basics we've talked about quite often on this podcast. Reducing the grazing area, so our temporary fencing, our polywire divisions can become particularly useful at this stage of the season. That can cut down the paddock size, help you get them graze outs and cut down that residency period. And also maybe in certain cases, Damien, allows you to drop out parts of fields, maybe for a mower at a later stage. Your other option, of course, is to try and add stock into it. So either grouping up batches of ewes in that last rotation pre-weaning, maybe put the younger group in with the older group, doubling up the size, you're going to get through it quicker. Or if there's cattle on the farm, maybe rotating them in with them as well is a good way of getting that graze out in time. Just basically increasing the stocking rate on that area at one time. But it'll help them get through it. It keeps them moving quicker. And in theory, Damien, that helps them keep higher quality grass coming into that diet on a more regular basis.
Absolutely, and I think you hit the nail on the head there. It has turned around fairly quickly in terms of the grass growth over the last few days. I suppose maybe sometimes the temptation with people is then to skip fertilizer applications and that kind of thing. What's your advice on that?
Yeah, this is where it kind of seems contrary. 1 minute we're talking about high growth rates and excess of grass, but bear in mind we're at the highest growth rate period in the season, so it will change again quite quickly. And the fertilizer is important not only to keep supply going in that next rotation, but also to help maintain quality in that sward at this stage of the season. So look, a lot of this depends on the stock rate in the farm and other demands, whether it be need for excess silage or otherwise. But something in the order of 10 to 15 units an acre of nitrogen on higher stock rate farms is advisable. Maybe splitting that application across the month half beginning of the month, maybe the other half in the second half of the month, just to keep that going on. Because as I said, we are coming out of a very high growth rate period, but that will taper off a little bit. So,
Mm.
and I suppose you also have to consider, Damien, like that lower growth rate in the early part of the season. We've seen silage ground on that graze, and I suppose yields in certain cases might be back on that. So I think in most cases on farms this year, if we have surplus, that's not going to be a big issue in terms of it'll all be a wanting.
Yeah, I think definitely the weather conditions in springtime, maybe on some farms at least, delayed the closing for silage. So it's important, I suppose, that they maybe take stock and do a budget in terms of their requirements for the coming season.
Yeah, like in fairness, I think you're right. We're after coming off the back. 2025 was a very good year in terms of silage yields and quality, and put a lot of bales and put a lot of silage in pits. But the long spring, particularly in mixed farms, really took care of a lot of that. So that, coupled with the fact, as you indicated there, ground was closed up later. Maybe the total amount of fertilizer was delayed. Certainly, slurry applications in spring were delayed, and that will have an impact on silage yields. So if there is excess there, the opportunity to drop out extra, I think I will be taking it. So
Yeah,
I suppose the key thing there, like if we look back, even what we mentioned about the grazing, Johan was mentioned the target days ahead. One of the key things there, if that's in your grazing block and your grazing block is fairly well stocked, if you are going to drop it out, it's important you get it dropped out now, take that surplus out of it, and get it back into the rotation post weaning. So I
exactly. Yeah.
suppose you maybe have a big long close up Damien on it, as in a planned silage cut. You're taking that surplus, and it might sometimes align itself well to when you're actually taking your cut of silage to drop them paddocks and get them going and get them back in again.
Yeah, and just as you mentioned there, the weaning, I suppose, you mentioned earlier March barn lambs. Sure, I suppose in this month they'll be approaching weaning time.
Yeah, look, it's that stage of the season. You always have the bulk of the work done. Like if we think about it, your typical twin ewe out there, our milk yield is peaking at kind of 5 to 6 weeks of age after lambing, and it's declining after. So from about 7 or 8 weeks onwards, our lambs are consuming a significant quantity of grass, and that's really reducing the reliance on milk. So as that ewe milk yield tapers off, lamb intake increases. By the time they reach kind of 10, 12 weeks of age, they're consuming around that kilo of grass per day. So they're directly competing with ewes for feed. And if we look at it in a lot of cases, where grass supply is limited, that competition can sometimes be counterproductive at that stage. So our general recommendation has always been to wean around 14 weeks of age. Um, Probably for the benefit of the ewes as much sometimes as the lambs in terms of getting them ready again for the following breeding season. So you have to think about that, Damien. If we kind of count that in, we count a wee bit of dry period. We've only probably about 14 weeks again before the ewes are going to the ram to build on that condition. So
Yeah,
it's
and I
it's both
suppose.
benefiting the lamb and the ewe.
Yeah, and I suppose given there's a little bit of a lead-in time, a bit of preparation to be done in terms of planning. If we're talking of a lot of farms maybe considering weaning and the mid to late June period, maybe now is the time to be planning for that weaning.
Yeah, look, in most cases, we're on the final rotation before weaning. So your grass rotation really needs to be planned so as we have access to high quality grass, a field of nice grass, whether it be after grass or just good quality grass that's been well minded or well maintained during the year. Well fenced paddock, obviously, for logical reasons, for lambs immediately after weaning. We're always trying to target the best available pasture on the farm for them. So whether that be after grass, whether there's a reseed, whether there's a field that's just been really well grazed out during the year. That needs to be kind of put in place now because look at we're within kind of 2 to 3 weeks for most flocks of weaning. And again, look at if you can at all have a bit of distance maybe between where the ewes are going to be weaned into and where we're going to put the wean lambs into. So that final paddock that they come out of the day before weaning, and that's where we put them back into the ewes, that there's a wee bit of distance between both. That just helps let the thing settle down a wee bit less
to to
calling
to
maybe
to
between the
to,
two of
to,
them.
to break the bond. And as you mentioned earlier on, I suppose taking out maybe taking out surplus paddock right now, would lend itself to having a nice aftergrass for lambs in the post weaning period. So
Yeah.
I suppose what about the management? You mentioned the O's going into say um, a bare paddock to aid the drying off process. What are your tips on managing the O's that immediate week or two after weaning?
Yeah, it's important when we do them in that week. I think like my preference has always been a bare paddock outside. Some previously will have maybe thought about housing ewes or that. That's a bit riskier because look at the hygiene in that house. It's very hard to maintain it to the same level at that stage. So a bare paddock for 7 to 10 days. That's really just to aid that drain off period and reduce the risk of mastitis. So we're just reducing that Joe's energy intake on that, and that will start to dry them off. Look, the process shouldn't be overdone. Certainly do not restrict water during that period. But that 7 to 10 days will allow them to dry off significantly and or sufficiently. And from then on, we're fairly good to go again. I suppose the key thing there really, Damon, is that once we've got 7 to 10 days done, we need to kind of move on from that. And what we should really consider then is what are we doing with those ewes to improve the condition again in them? Because it could be a mixture there. Like it's been a hard spring on ewes. So it has, so there's some in that will actually need a wee bit more minding afterwards, whereas others are probably in okay nick. So yeah, there's a whole culling exercise, all that has to be done, but we need to look at how we actually manage those ewes and do we need to divide them up after that period?
Yeah, I'll come back to you on the culling one in a second, but just maybe to finish off on the post-weaning period, um, lambs, I suppose the management of lambs, you're obviously trying to target the better quality grass to the lambs straight after weaning.
Yeah, no, definitely. And so look with the lamb group, I probably avoid much splitting up with them, Damien, for that first week or 10 days post weaning. So we'll just keep them as a group. I suppose in terms of grazing management, certainly on reseeds and that we can graze it fairly tight, but in most swards, I don't think we should be grazing much tighter than 5.5 to 6 centimeters, lifting our residuals slightly. There's going to be ewes on the farm, there's maybe dry hoggets or other stock classes we can graze out. So what we're trying to do is give them the most push on we can at that period. Once we've that spell over us, we can look at well how we're going to actually maybe divide these up or group them up. So split them on the basis of weight, maybe putting together a finished group of heavier lambs, split them on the basis of gender. That can make sense. Maybe pulling out the replacement new lambs and running them separately. It gives an opportunity, maybe, Damien, for some more targeted supplementation if it's needed. And from a grassland management perspective, when we go in and when we wean, we can significantly reduce our feed demand on the farm because our ewe intake decreases significantly. So it really does effectively let us run that leader follower system and really push them lambs on as much as we can and feed, the stock classes that need it more or give them access to the best quality grass.
Yeah, no, that's really useful, and as you say, it allows you if you do need to introduce supplementation, maybe to a finishing group or that you can, it facilitates that, I suppose. I suppose you mentioned earlier on, I suppose, weaning at a good rule of thumb with weaning at 14 weeks of age. I suppose maybe in situations where grass is tight for drought or other reasons, like are there any situations where you can go a little bit earlier with weaning or?
Yeah, look, what we talked about there is probably the regular scenario, and sometimes it can be difficult maybe to get over that hurdle at weaning at 14 weeks. But there are flocks out there that will go in at earlier weaning, and it is something that can be practically considered. So from about 10 weeks onward, Damien, lambs can be successfully managed at grass, from both from a nutrition and a health point of view, it's making up the bulk of the diet. So it's not a massive challenge to them there. And I suppose there are a few circumstances where it's actually a benefit to both the ewes, lambs, and maybe the overall farm management. So you mentioned drought, certainly in drought-prone areas, that hit that kind of tight pinch spot in maybe early June. Weaning, as I said before, it can significantly reduce feed demand because we drop our ewe intake from about 2.5 kilos down to about a kilo. So that has a major impact on the feed demand on the farm. So it
Mhm.
does. We can prioritise the grazing in those situations for lambs, help to try and build cover again on those farms. So it gets them through that period. Probably the two other big ones that will come up, obviously yearling ewes. So ewes that lamb at 1 year old,
Yeah.
they're still growing on. So they are. So weaning them at 10 to 12 weeks of age gives them a longer dry period before the following year. So often one of the criticisms of lamb and ewe lambs is they're too thin as hoggets or too hard to get them back in. They don't grow on well enough. How we manage them in that dry period has a big impact as well on that. So, going in maybe at 10 to 12 weeks of age on those, you can buy yourself an extra 2 to 3 weeks at that point. So you can give them a chance to put on that little bit extra condition. So you can get them, you can basically start ramping them up again a bit earlier. Also need to consider that the milk contribution from them is generally lower to those lambs. So it actually helps the lambs adapt to that forage-based diet or forage plus supplement at an earlier point. And I suppose the last one, and this one is probably relevant enough this year because look, difficult spring. So as we've seen the effects of that on some farms, others less so. Ewes maybe in flocks, Damien, that are in poor condition. Maybe just after the bad year that we had or the bad spring we had, they're in bad condition this year, or flocks that maybe struggle with on a continual basis. One thing we can actually do in active management we can do to maybe break that cycle is weaning those ewes that little bit earlier. Same stories with the ewe lambs. If we start weaning them maybe at 10 to 12 weeks of age, likelihood is if those ewes are in poor condition, they're not contributing much milk to those lambs. I'm not on about the ewe that has worked hard. I'm on about flocks that are continually struggling. So we can get them weaned off and get them dried. It buys us that extra 2 to 3 weeks as well to help them back on that bit of condition and helps break that cycle in poor performance. And again, maybe gives us that opportunity for more target supplementation to those lambs as well. So that can be a positive impact on a flock like that as well. And once managed right, and once we have good grass or good feed to put those lambs to, or certainly that we don't have to push them aside grazing out stemmy swards, it's a benefit to the lambs as well on those farms.
Yeah, it gives you, as you said, breaks the cycle and it gives you those extra few weeks to build body condition before the next mating period. And again, like as it was following on from that, we mentioned culls earlier on. I suppose it's when you've completed the drying off of the ewes, it's a good time to identify the culls that are not going to be part of the breeding flock next year.
No, it is. And look, I suppose culling's probably an ongoing thing, or should be certainly an ongoing thing on farms right the way from our scanning right the way through, or even from mating the previous year. So we're going to have the things at Lambton that hopefully, we've identified those ewes in some form or other, whether it be cull tags or otherwise. But it is a good opportunity to go back through that flock and weaning them. Maybe when you get them ewes just dried off and take a pick at them and say, right, well, what's staying here? So we're checking for all the obvious things. Teeth, age, all those things need to be factored in. I suppose what we do with those, Damian, really depends on each farm situation. There will be some thinner ewes in that culled, whether they decide to keep them on and let them put on a wee bit of weight again before sale, or go with them straight away. It would depend.
The trade is reasonably good at the minute, isn't it?
The trade is reasonably good, like especially on heavier ewes, it's reasonably good. It could be a case of just weighing up on what you want to go with. And I suppose the thing is, Damian, like when they're there and they're ready and fit for sale, maybe the time is to move them on. Obviously, scheme dependent in certain cases, but yeah, it could be a good thing. But it's one thing that's worth spending a wee bit of time on, Damian, is going through the ewe flock at this stage of the season. And I think probably, given the spring we've had, anecdotally, certainly it's been a very challenging year for mastitis. We typically do see that in most challenging springs, whether it be just the harsh weather or the fact that maybe feed supply was limited or just a wee bit harder on ewes. We see more mastitis out there now, where some of those are obvious. Our parakeets and that have probably taken care of themselves in certain cases. It's worthwhile just handling the others on those ewes and assessing the teats for lumps, any hardness that's there, blind quarters, or teeth damage that we would have seen this spring. Like ewes showing signs of that chronic mastitis or teeth problems really should be considered for culling, because they are going to be problem cases next spring, whether it be the ewe that has no milk on one side at Lambton, or those that will exhibit that really acute mastitis next spring that was probably in the form of chronic mastitis this year. So I would advocate that we maybe cull a little bit harder on that. I think there's more subclinical mastitis coming through year to year in flocks, so we're not actually culling for. Certainly they only increase management difficulties next spring, and maybe more mortality, maybe more orphan lambs in the following year. So I think given the year we've had, Damian, I would spend a wee bit extra time maybe just going back through that on ewes.
It's definitely well worth it from a it will improve your flock performance over time as well if you're taking out these problem cases before they become a problem, I suppose. So and I suppose
it certainly is. And look, I suppose the one challenge that comes with that most times, Damian, is we have to have enough replacements that are coming in to allow us to do that. But that's the kind of longer term thing. Those of the ewes are really pulling back performance every year.
Yeah.
And when they're in good form and good nick, and that's the time to move them on.
Yeah. And it probably is worth keeping the extra few replacements, for the coming years in terms of having the option to cull that bit harder and get rid of the poor performers and the problem ones. I suppose the other big job that's happening, I suppose, is shearing. We've seen lots of sheep shorn over the last couple of weeks. In terms of preparing and having best practice for shearing, have you any tips, or what's the key points to remember?
Yeah, the winter coats are coming off some of the sheep already. You can start to see a few bare ones. And look, we're typically it's at the early stage of the season yet, so it is. It seems to be back a little bit earlier most years, but yeah, look, I swear it is one of the busiest days on a farm. So being prepared, both in terms of prep and setup for it, along with how we handle that fleece and how we store it afterwards, can help improve wool quality and get a bit better returns and make the whole job easier, both on farmers, the sheep, and the shearers themselves. I suppose on the positive this year is, Damian, the wool value has certainly gone up a lot, which is good to see.
It's welcome, yeah.
It's increased significantly since last year. I think we're sitting kind of around 70 cent a kilo. So at the moment, so that will certainly help some of the costs in and put a bit more value on it. But like some of the basics kind of go back into this. I suppose we think about it before shearing. There's a couple of key things we need to look at. Sheep need to be dry for shearing. So broken weather at the moment, not easy. A little bit of plan ahead, a little bit of dialogue with your shearing crew coming in and out. If needs be, maybe some of them sheep should be housed beforehand. Again, if you're talking about housing, Damian, slats certainly will work. Bedding that's built up over the winter will work. What you're trying to avoid there was fresh straw, because that can stick to the fleece and that vegetative matter.
Yeah.
It's not good afterwards. It's a challenge for those that are trying to handle that wool afterwards. Fasten that sheep beforehand is important. Certainly, it's a little bit easier on the sheep. So it's when they're healed up. And it's certainly easier on the shearer. It's a couple of less kilos to be dragging around. So it leaves the process more comfortable for the sheep and certainly easier on the shearer. Again, separating the lambs off prior to shearing just helps speed the thing up, helps improve it. Generally, the ewes will run out better back to the lambs afterwards as well. Some of the other basics, look, are moving dags. You don't want very dirty back ends going in on it. Ideally, that should be done beforehand. If it can't be done, look, take it off the fleece after shearing it and clean it off, remove all those dags from it. That shouldn't be stored afterwards. Probably one of the little basic things we're talking here about the fresh bedding in the shed if you had to house them. Same goes to the holding pens. Keep them free from straw, shavings, or any other debris. Sheep are going to kind of slip onto them, lay down onto them. So you're trying to avoid any contamination on that fleece because it can reduce the value. So that's a couple of things maybe before shearing we just need to focus on. And again, having that bit of a setup there, or that bit of race and pens to lead them into it is important.
Making it that bit easier. And I suppose in terms of storage and handling of the wool afterwards, between now and getting it to the wool merchant.
Yeah, so look, at the best practice in this is kind of covers the basics again, like obviously, and it seems very basic, but keeping that fleece clean. So trying to keep it avoiding contact with dirty floors, so whether it be a sheet of plywood down, some tarp or that down, that when you're handling that fleece afterwards, it's kept clean. Keep it free of any of those bedding materials we mentioned earlier. That's important. And again, if you can at all, that basic bit of rolling on the fleece does help for those that are trying to grade it afterwards. Some of the basic things, if we have coloured sheep in there, particularly sheep with black wool in them, stained or contaminated fleeces, store them separately. Have a separate bag for those type of fleeces. So maybe some that have got damaged, maybe with some blowfly strike or coloured wool. Keep that separate from the white wool, because it only takes one, soil fleece or one black fleece within it to destroy the whole pack. In terms of storage, you need to store them in a clean, dry, well-ventilated area to try to prevent dampness. Try to keep them up off the ground, so stacking them on pallets and that will help, because it can absorb moisture up through the bags and that. So we want to try and avoid that. Ideally, there's some merchants will have wool bags or wool packs for fleeces. Just make sure the bags we're storing them to is clean. So that can damage the fleece as well. And I suppose the other thing is to get them to the merchant fairly soon, because the longer they lay around on the farm, the more they can deteriorate.
I think that's very useful and good to hear that the wool price is on the up. Ciaran, thanks very much for all that. I think lots of useful tips there for the coming weeks.
No problem, Damian. Good chatting to you. We'll leave it there for this week's episode. I'd like to thank Damian again for stepping into the hot seat. I have included a link in the show notes to June Sheep Teaser, where you can find out more about what we were discussing in that episode. That's it for me. Don't forget to subscribe and follow us wherever you get your podcasts.